So we're going to get our first look at the TI-84 calculator. Now if you have a TI-83 or a TI-84, either way, everything's pretty much the same. There are maybe a couple of slight differences in the appearance of the screen or in the placement of one or two buttons, but for the most part they are the same calculator. It doesn't matter what other things it says up here. It may just say TI-83 or TI-84. It may say plus, it may say TI-84 plus C or plus CE, doesn't matter. They're all the same functionality as far as inputting an equation, evaluating it, graphing, etc. The color calculators are nice, and the newer TI-84s have some nice functionality that make it easy to type certain equations in, including fractions, among other things, but for all intents and purposes, they're the same calculator. So whichever one you have, you can follow along with this. Now, we're going to look at a couple of basics, such as graphing an equation and viewing it on the calculator. So if you're going to graph, you are going to be starting with these 5 buttons right underneath the screen. Everything about the graph is going to come basically from those 5 buttons. Now one other thing before we go too far, you'll notice every button has above it something in blue and something in green. Or they all have something in blue, most of them have something in green as well, whether it's F1, F2, F3, etc., or the letters of the alphabet as you see down here. Those are color-coded to the second button and the alpha button. Those are basically like the shift key on a keyboard. So if you're looking at your keyboard, you might notice like the numbers along the top, the number 1 has the exclamation point above it. So you have to hold down the shift button to make it type the exclamation point when you type that. Well, okay, you don't have to hold it down here, you just have to press it, but it's the same basic idea. If you want to access the math menu, you just press the button, but if you want to get into the test menu, you have to hit second first. So if you just press the math button, it takes you into this menu. If you want to get into the test menu, you have to press second first. You'll notice the icon is turned into an arrow pointing up, and now it takes you into a different menu. If you want to type the letter A, you'd have to click alpha. Notice that the icon is a capital letter A now, and that will allow you to type. You have to do this repeatedly, like every single new time you want a blue thing is above it, you have to hit second and then that thing, or alpha and then that thing. So it's not the greatest system, but it works. So, as I said, if we're going to graph, we want to start with the 5 buttons under here, starting from the left. The calculator can't graph anything until you give it an equation to graph. So we press Y equals, and it brings us into here. Before we go too far, if you are using your calculator, if you've used it in a stats class, or you borrowed it from a friend or lent it to a friend and they used it in a stats class, or even if you just put it in your bag without the cover on and maybe just some buttons got mashed, you may occasionally see these 3 things at the top. If you ever see any of them in a black box, it means that that is an active mode for the calculator. Those plots are something that you would use in statistics. We will not be using them in this course at all. So if you ever see those highlighted in the black box, it means they're active, and it's going to make it very difficult for you to graph. So you can very easily toggle them by just putting the flashing cursor on it and pressing enter. So you'll notice when I'm pressing the buttons, by the way, that they are popping up red down here. But you'll notice the box is now gone. So now we're free to type in whatever equation we would like in order to graph. So let's start with something simple. We'll do a basic quadratic function, y equals x squared plus x minus 6. So we've already got the y equals, that's built in. You notice the subscript as well. The calculator can actually do up to 10 different equations graphed at the same time. You'll never have to graph that many, but it also can store the equation. So if you want to type it in and then leave it stored but not graph it, there's a way to do that. So you can store up to 10 equations and even graph up to 10 at a time, but we'll never have to graph more than 1 or 2. So, very simple to type it in. You've got all the numbers down here. You've got the operators to the right. You've got some of the more advanced operators like x squared, the square root. Later in the semester we'll see some other things that are on here, but those are basically what we would need right now. And this is the more general exponent caret, so if you need to raise it to any power. Now, as soon as I start typing, you're going to start to see a little bit of a difference between what's on my screen and what some of you may have. If you have the color calculators, what I do, you're going to see you're going to see exactly the same thing. If you have one of the TI-83s or maybe one of the older TI-84s, you're going to notice some slight differences. So let me get started. Now, we can actually type the letter X by using the alpha, and then the X is down here, the second button up from the bottom on the left. But there's also a button up here that says X, T, theta, N. The T, the theta, and the N, don't worry about those. In this course, you'll never use them. In fact, you wouldn't even use any of them until at least Calc 2. Long ways off. If many of you may not even have to go there. So, as far as we're concerned, this button is the X button. And it's a little faster than having to hit alpha X every time. So, X. So as I said, we're going to do x squared minus x, or plus x rather, minus 6. So here's where you're going to first notice a difference. When I type the square button, it puts a little 2 up there, and that should be basically the same for all the calculators. We will start to notice a difference when we have to do other powers, but for now this will do. Plus x minus 6. Okay. That's all we need to do for the moment. You'll notice, by the way, that as soon as you started typing, the equal sign got highlighted, much as the plot 1 had been highlighted before. So this is showing us that this is an active equation for the calculator. So when we go to graph, it's going to graph this equation. Now, we could just press the graph button and go straight to the graph. However, as you use the calculator, you are at times going to make changes to some of the settings in the calculator. So it's a good idea when you first start with a new function, a new equation to graph, that you always reset the graph to the standard dimensions. We can do that very quickly by pressing the zoom button in the middle up here along the top. Now there's a lot of different options in here, but there's really only one you will ever use in this course. If you were ever to take a stats class, you might use the zoom stat, but those should be about the only 2 that you ever actually use. The rest of them are not as easy or as nice as they might seem. Including the zoom in and zoom out, they really don't work very well. But before I can explain that, let's get an idea of what we're looking at. So let's go to zoom standard. You can either scroll down and hit enter when you're on it, or you can just press the number 6. It will take you directly to the graphing window. Now, the color calculators tend to be just a tad bit slower because they have more pixels, they have a greater resolution, so they tend to be a bit slower to graph than the black and white calculators, but regardless, you're going to get the same thing. Now, the standard viewing window. This is the origin, of course, where the axes cross, which makes this -10, and on the right side, +10. Downward, -10, and upward, +10. Those are the dimensions of the standard window. The calculator, unfortunately, will not label the tick marks with any numbers, so you need to be aware of what you're looking at with the scale. And the standard window always gives us a good place to start. In this case, I chose this function so that when we do the standard window, it's appropriate. This is a standard parabola, nothing fancy, so we can see all that we're really supposed to see with it. So, what happens if the standard window is not appropriate? Well, let's go back and look at a different function. Now, I don't want to erase this. I'd like to keep it there, but I don't want to graph it. I want to switch to something else. So I'm going to put the cursor on the equal sign and hit enter. Notice it's no longer highlighted. So I've deactivated that equation. It's still there, and we can reactivate it at any point that we choose, but for the moment, it will not be graphed by the calculator when we go to the graph. If you want to see that, we can just press the graph button and it's gone. There's nothing there. So I'd like to take a look at another graph. This one we're going to go a little bit higher degree. So this time we're going to do y equals x cubed minus 2x squared minus 15x. So to get a power of 3, there's a square down here, but there's nothing for higher powers, so that's where we have to use the exponent caret. And this is what I was talking about before about how things are going to look a little different. See, when I press the exponent caret, I get a little box with the cursor in it up where an exponent should be. Those of you guys with the newer calculators will get that. And it's kind of nice because, literally all you have to do is just type in the exponent you want. And then notice that the cursor has a little right arrow. That is so that it's to remind us to press the right button to get out of that exponent box and back down to the rest of it. So let me finish this up and then I'll come back to what it would look like if you don't have that. So x cubed minus 2x, and here we can just use the square, minus 15x. Now, the newer calculators have that ability to write something in what they call the calculator calls math print. That's what this MP up here, these are some of the settings of the calculator, and the MP up there means math print. We can actually, I don't know why you'd ever want to, but you can go back to the original format that the TI-83s have. So, if your calculator does it like mine with the little exponent box, I would leave it like that. I would never change that. That's a phenomenal upgrade that they've done over the years. But if you have an older calculator, I'm just going to do this to show you what it looks like. So, in the mode here, I'm going to go to the classic setting. You'll notice the setting is now changed to CL. And I'm just going to come down here to type in the same thing so you can see what it's going to look like. X, oh, hello. It actually types the exponent caret. And the 3 is as big as everything else instead of small and raised up like an exponent. That's not a problem. Ooh, excuse me. That's not a problem. But you do need to be careful because things are more complicated equations are going to require a little bit more care in how you type them in because it's not going to look as mathy as we might like. We'll get to that when we get to some future functions. For now, I want to keep it kind of simple, but I just wanted to illustrate for those of you guys who do have the 83, that's what you're going to see that looks a little bit different. Let me go back to the math print mode. Okay, so the quadratic equation is deactivated, and we now have our new equation. Now, again, it's always a good idea to start a new graph, a new equation, by zooming to the standard window because, if you haven't touched your calculator in a few days, maybe you don't remember how you left it. So it's a good idea to always start by doing zoom 6 for the standard window. So, okay, first notice in the color, this is in red. One of the big benefits of the color calculator is the multiple colors if you have to graph more than one thing. Now, my emulator, because it's powered by a computer, graphs very quickly, but your calculators will graph it a little more slowly. And if you're watching it as it graphs it, you'll actually see it trace upward and then downward and then upward again. That implies that if it went up and then comes back down, it must have curved around, topped out, peaked out, if you will. And then down here, if it went down and then came back up, it must have bottomed out somewhere in between. But we can't see those things. And the reason we can't is that the standard window only goes from -10 to +10 along the x-axis, and from -10 to +10 along the y-axis. Now, as far as the x-axis goes, that is probably fine. But obviously this extends up above 10, and over here extends down below -10. So we're going to want to make some changes to the y-axis. We don't have any reason to make changes to the x-axis. We may find some later, but at the moment we don't seem to have any reason to. So we don't want to change the x-axis. And that's why the zoom functions are not good. We do want to zoom out in a way, but if we choose that command, it's going to zoom out all 4 directions. We don't want the x-axis to change. That's why the zoom in and zoom out aren't very good, because they affect all 4 directions. Sometimes we only want to move 1 or maybe 2 directions. So those are not good choices. However, there is a button down here that says Window. And if we press that, we will see a number of things here that we can change manually. The x minimum, that is -10. That's how far to the left. That's the smallest x value we see on the x-axis. And the x maximum, that is the largest value we see on the x-axis. Now, as we said, we don't want to change those. This here is the scale on the x-axis. It refers to how often it puts a tick mark. It is not actually necessary to ever change that. It only tends to make the graph a little bit neater. So if your axis is going from -100 to +100, maybe trying to fit 100 pixels to the left and 100 pixels to the right, or tick marks rather, isn't the best idea. So you might change that just to make it look a little nicer, but it's actually not necessary to change that just to see a graph. Now, we did say that we want to change the y-axis because the y minimum is -10, but if you recall, the graph dipped below that. It also dipped above +10 on the one side. So we're going to want to change these two things. I'm going to suggest that we change one at a time. Eventually you get good enough with this, you'll feel more comfortable, you can make multiple changes at the same time, but I would like to take it slow. Now, 10 wasn't quite high enough. Let's go back to the graph for a moment. 10 isn't quite high enough. The graph definitely goes above 10. It doesn't look like it has much room to go much higher above 10 before it curves back down, so I don't think we need to extend that too far. That being said, there is no right or wrong answer. I mean, you can go obviously way too far or not far enough, but no problem. You just come back in and then you can always change it again if you don't like where it is. So I'm going to choose 20. I know that's probably farther than I need to go, but I'd like to see what it looks like. Well, that certainly gave us a clear view of that peak. And as you can see, yeah, it doesn't go all the way up to 20, but that's okay. We don't need it to peak at the very top of the screen. Sometimes it's actually nicer for it to have a little bit of extra space there. Now we're ready to change the other one. This one looks like it's going to have to dip a bit lower. So let's go back into the window and let's change the Y min. We should change that to say, well, let's try it. It's trial and error. And if we don't like what we got, we go back in and we try again. Let's maybe go -20. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to point out the big difference between the negative button down here and the subtraction operation. They are two different buttons for two different things. Actually, whatever word you would say if you said it aloud, that's the button you press. So if we want it to be at -20, we need to press the negative button. So I'm going to clear out the -10 and type in -20. Okay, so we still see the peak there. That's good, we haven't changed that, we should still see it. And this does still bottom out, but it's still further down. Okay, so -20 wasn't quite far enough. Let's go further. Now, I'm of the belief I don't like to do just a little bit and then have to go in and go a little bit more and then a little bit more. I mean, we certainly don't want to go down to like -2000. But I think maybe we could go a little bit further than just, we went from -10 to -20. I suppose next we might try -30, but I think we could go further than that. And if we need to bring it back in, we always can. So I'm going to try -50. Now maybe that's too far. No problem. We come back in and we change it. Actually, that's not bad. It's definitely further than we needed to go, but again, it's not a horrible thing to have a little extra space down here. Now, part of the reason why it's not a bad idea to have extra space is, look at what's up here. This is peaking a lot closer to the top than it did before, isn't it? So maybe having that little bit of space wasn't such a bad idea, because as we expanded the range of the y-axis, we actually kind of compressed the picture because the screen is only so big. So if we're trying to show more of the y-axis, we actually are kind of squashing it down to fit inside the viewing window. So it kind of compresses that, and that's why this this appears to peak closer to the top of the screen than it did before. So it's always good to have a little bit of extra space. Never hurts. Now, that being said, look at all these tick marks. Remember, we're now going from -50 all the way up to +20. That's 70 tick marks is trying to fit in there. That's a little ridiculous. So, I mean, it's not like it hurts anything to have it like that, but if that really bothers you to look at, you can always come in here and change the scale. I think if we're going from -50 up to +20, maybe going by 5s is a little more reasonable, see, now that's a much more reasonable scale. You could have it go by whatever you want. By 5s, by 3s, by 10s. I tend to like using 5s and 10s, but that's just me. And this seems to be a decent picture of our graph. Definitely beyond the standard viewing window, but that's what was needed to see this graph. So that's your basics for inputting functions and graphing them and adjusting the window. I'm going to cap this video there just to keep them manageable in length. For the next video, I'm going to leave these two equations here. The next video is going to use them to start finding things on the graph using the calculator.